IB and little Christina. In the forest that extends from the banks of the Gudenau in North Jutland, a long way into the country, and not far from the clear stream, rises a great ridge of land, which stretches through the wood like a wall. Westward of this ridge, and not far from the river, stands a farmhouse, surrounded by such poor land that the sandy soil shows itself between the scanty ears of rye and wheat which grow in it. Some years have passed since the people who lived here cultivated these fields. They kept 3 sheep, a pig, and 2 oxen. In fact, they maintained themselves very well. They had quite enough to live upon, as people generally have, who are content with their lot. They even could have afforded to keep 2 horses, but it was a saying among the farmers in those parts, "The horse eats himself up." That is to say, he eats as much as he earns. Jeppy Johns cultivated his fields in summer, and in the winter he made wooden shoes. He also had an assistant, a lad who understood as well as he himself did how to make wooden shoes strong, but light and in the fashion. They carved shoes and spoons, which paid well. Therefore, no one could justly call Jeppy Johns and his family poor people. Little IB, a boy of 7 years old and the only child, would sit by, watching the workmen or cutting a stick, and sometimes his finger instead of the stick. But one day, IB succeeded so well in his carving that he made 2 pieces of wood look really like 2 little wooden shoes, and he determined to give them as a present to little Christina. And who was little Christina? She was the boatman's daughter. Graceful and delicate as the child of a gentleman, had she been dressed differently, no one would have believed that she lived in a hut on the neighboring heath with her father. He was a widower, and earned his living by carrying firewood in his large boat from the forest to the eel pond and eel weir on the estate of Silkeborg, and sometimes even to the distant town of Randers. There was no one under whose care he could leave little Christina, so she was almost always with him in his boat, or playing in the wood among the blossoming heath, or picking the ripe wild berries. Sometimes, when her father had to go as far as the town, he would take little Christina, who was a year younger than IB, across the heath to the cottage of Jeppy Johns and leave her there. IB and Christina agreed together in everything. They divided their bread and berries when they were hungry. They were partners in digging their little gardens. They ran and crept and played about everywhere. Once they wandered a long way into the forest and even ventured together to climb the high ridge. Another time they found a few snipes' eggs in the wood, which was a great event. IB had never been on the heath where Christina's father lived, or on the river. But at last came an opportunity. The boatman invited him to go for a sail in his boat, and the evening before he accompanied the boatman across the heath to his home. The next morning early, the 2 children were placed on the top of a high pile of firewood in the boat and sat eating bread and wild strawberries while Christina's father and his man drove the boat forward with poles. They floated on swiftly, for the tide was in their favor, passing over lakes formed by the stream in its course. Sometimes they seemed quite enclosed by reeds and water plants, yet there was always room for them to pass out, although the old trees overhung the water and the old oaks stretched out their bare branches as if they had turned up their sleeves and wished to show their knotty, naked arms. Old alder trees, whose roots were loosened from the banks, clung with their fibers to the bottom of the stream, and the tops of the branches above the water looked like little woody islands. The water lilies waved themselves to and fro on the river. Everything made the excursion beautiful, and at last they came to the great eel weir, where the water rushed through the floodgates, and the children thought this a beautiful sight. In those days, there was no factory or any townhouse, nothing but the great farm with its scanty bearing fields, in which could be seen a few herd of cattle and 1 or 2 farm laborers. The rushing of the water through the sluices and the scream of the wild ducks were almost the only signs of active life at Silkeborg. After the firewood had been unloaded, Christina's father bought a whole bundle of eels and a sucking pig, which were all placed in a basket in the stern of the boat. Then they returned again up the stream, and as the wind was in favor, 2 sails were hoisted, which carried the boat on as well as 2 horses had been harnessed to it. As they sailed on, they came by chance to the place where the boatman's assistant lived at a little distance from the bank of the river. The boat was moored, and the 2 men, after desiring the children to sit still, both went on shore. They obeyed this order for a very short time, then forgot about it altogether. First, they peeped into the basket containing the eels and the sucking pig. Then they must needs pull out the pig and take it in their hands and feel it and touch it, and as they both wanted to hold it at the same time, the consequence was that they let it fall into the water, and the pig sailed away with the stream. Here was a terrible disaster. Ivy jumped ashore and ran a little distance from the boat. "Oh, take me with you!" cried Christina, and she sprang after him. In a few minutes, they found themselves deep in a thicket and could no longer see the boat or the shore. They ran on a little further, then Christina fell down and began to cry. Ivy helped her up and said, "Never mind, follow me. Yonder is the house." But the house was not yonder, and they wandered still further over the dry, rustling leaves of the last year and treading on fallen branches that crackled under their little feet. Then they heard a loud, piercing cry, and they stood still to listen. Presently, the scream of an eagle sounded through the wood. It was an ugly cry, and it frightened the children. But before them, in the thickest part of the forest, grew the most beautiful blackberries in wonderful quantities. They looked so inviting that the children couldn't help stopping, and they remained there so long eating that their mouths and cheeks became quite black with the juice. Presently, they heard the frightful scream again, and Christina said, "We shall get in trouble about that pig." "Oh, never mind," said Ivy. "We will go home to my father's house. It's here in the wood." So they went on, but the road led them out of the way. No house could be seen. It grew dark, and the children were afraid. The solemn stillness that reigned around them was now and then broken by the shrill cries of the great horned owl and other birds that they knew nothing of. At last they both lost themselves in the thicket. Christina began to cry, and then Ivy cried too, and after weeping and lamenting for some time, they stretched themselves down on the dry leaves and fell asleep. The sun was high in the heavens when the 2 children woke. They felt cold, but not far from their resting place, on a hill, the sun was shining through the trees. They thought if they went there, they should be warm, and Ivy fancied he should be able to see his father's house from such a high spot. But they were far away from home now, in quite another part of the forest. They clambered to the top of the rising ground and found themselves on the edge of a declivity, which sloped down to a clear, transparent lake. Great quantities of fish could be seen through the clear water, sparkling in the sun's rays. They were quite surprised when they came so suddenly upon such an unexpected sight. Close to where they stood grew a hazel bush, covered with beautiful nuts. They soon gathered some, cracked them, and ate the fine young kernels which were only just ripe. But there was another surprise and fright in store for them. Out of the thicket stepped a tall old woman, her face quite brown and her hair of a deep, shining black. The whites of her eyes glittered like a Moor's. On her back she carried a bundle, and in her hand a knotted stick. She was a gypsy. The children did not at first understand what she said. She drew out of her pocket 3 large nuts, in which she told them were hidden the most beautiful and lovely things in the world, for they were wishing nuts. Ivy looked at her, and as she spoke so kindly, he took courage and asked her if he would give him the nuts. And the woman gave them to him, and then gathered some more from the bushes for herself, quite a pocketful. Ivy and Christina looked at the wishing nuts with wide open eyes. "Isn't this nut a carriage with a pair of horses?" asked Ivy. "Yes, there is a golden carriage with 2 golden horses," replied the woman. "Then give me that nut," said Christina. So Ivy gave it to her, and the strange woman tied up the nut for her in her handkerchief. Ivy held up another nut. Is there in this nut a pretty little neckerchief like the one Christina has on her neck? There are 10 neckerchiefs in it, as well as beautiful dresses, stockings, and a hat and veil, she replied. Then I will have that one also, said Christina, and it is a pretty one too. Then Ivy gave her the second nut. The third was a little black thing. You can keep that one, said Christina. It is quite as pretty. What is in it? Asked Ivy. The best of all things for you, replied the gypsy. So Ivy held the nut very tight. Then the woman promised to lead the children to the right path, that they might find their way home, and they went forward, certainly, in quite another direction to the one they meant to take. Therefore, no one should speak against the woman and say that she wanted to steal the children. In the